Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 15, and we're going to be going beyond just kind of the surface level reading of the text. We're going to be diving into some really profound stuff, I think, about faith and true purity, and even how God provides in ways we can't even imagine. You ready for this?
I am so ready. This chapter, it's really powerful. It gets at the heart of what it means to follow Jesus. And it does that through these stories that are just so vibrant and real. These encounters that Jesus has with people.
Yeah, right off the bat, we run into this confrontation between Jesus and the Pharisees. And just to remind everyone, these are the religious leaders of the time.
Yeah.
And they were really known for emphasizing rules and regulations.
Right.
They were coming to Jesus about his disciples not washing their hands before eating.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, when we think of hand washing today, we automatically go to hygiene. But for the Pharisees, it wasn't about that. It was all about ritual purity, maintaining this outward appearance of holiness. And they had built up all these elaborate traditions around it.
So they were really missing the point.
Oh, totally.
They were so focused on the external that they missed the heart of the matter.
Yeah, and Jesus, he calls them out on it. He quotes the commandment to honor your father and mother, and he shows how their traditions were actually contradicting God's commands.
Right. It's like they were so busy following their man-made rules that they completely missed the point of God's law.
Yeah, and then it gets even better. Because we get to verses 10 through 20 where Jesus gives us this incredible teaching. And he basically says it's not what goes into your mouth that defiles you, it's what comes out of your heart.
Oh man, that must have been so radical for them to hear.
Mm-hmm.
The Pharisees were all about outward appearances, but Jesus is saying, hey, it's the inside that matters. It's the state of your heart. It really does challenge our perspective, doesn't it? I mean, what do you think Jesus is really getting at here? Is he saying that outward actions don't matter at all?
That's a good question. I don't think it's that outward actions are irrelevant. I think it's more about recognizing the root of the issue. For Jesus, true holiness, it goes deeper than just external rituals. It's about the condition of our hearts, our thoughts, our motives, our desires, because it's from that inner space that our words and actions ultimately flow.
So, if we zoom out a little bit, it's about allowing God to transform us from the inside out.
Right.
Not just focusing on checking off a bunch of religious to-dos.
Absolutely. It's about surrendering to a process of inner transformation, allowing Jesus to work on those hidden parts of ourselves that we might not even want to acknowledge.
And that brings us to this next story, which I think is so powerful. The encounter with the Canaanite woman. And this woman, she's desperate for her daughter to be healed. Mm-hmm. And she comes to Jesus, even though she's from a completely different cultural and religious background.
Yeah, and what strikes me here is her persistence. Even when Jesus seems to ignore her at first, even when he uses this analogy about dogs that could come across as a little harsh, she doesn't give up.
Yeah, her response is pretty amazing. She says, even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. It's like she's acknowledging her place, but still clinging to this tiny sliver of hope.
That's it. That's exactly it. There's this beautiful balance in her approach. There's persistence, yes. But it's paired with humility. She's not demanding anything from Jesus. She's presenting her need before him with this deep trust that he can help.
Makes you think about how we approach prayer sometimes, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Do we give up too easily when we don't see those immediate answers? Do we come to God with that same mix of boldness and humility?
It's a powerful example to reflect on for sure. And ultimately, Jesus commends her faith and heals her daughter. It shows us that God responds to a heart that genuinely seeks him, regardless of background or circumstance.
It's so easy for us to read these stories and be like, wow, what incredible faith. But I wonder, have you ever been in a situation where you just felt like giving up? Like your prayers weren't getting through.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. I think we've all been there at some point, right? Where you come to God with this heavy heart.
Yeah.
You have this need that just feels so pressing and you don't see an immediate answer. It's like you're knocking on heaven's door and there's just silence.
Yeah, and it's in those moments I think the Canaanite woman's story becomes even more powerful because she faced that silence too. She faced what may have felt like rejection.
Yeah.
But instead of just walking away, she pressed in.
And I think that's one of the key takeaways for us, right? Persistence in prayer. It's not about trying to manipulate God or force him to do what we want. It's about staying connected, staying in that place of surrender and trust, even when it's really hard, even when we don't understand.
Yeah, because ultimately, we're not in control, right? We're coming to a God who sees the bigger picture, who knows what's best for us, even if it doesn't line up with, our immediate desires.
Yeah. And sometimes the answer isn't no. It's not yet, It's a process. It's God refining our faith, deepening our trust in his timing and his ways.
That's good. That's good. And speaking of trusting in God's provision, the very next story in Matthew 15 takes us to a scene that's pretty remarkable. The feeding of the 4,000. We've got this massive crowd that's been following Jesus for days. They're hungry, and the disciples are kind of freaking out a little bit.
It's such a classic picture of human limitation meeting divine possibility, right? The disciples are looking at the practical stuff. They have a few loaves of bread, a couple of fish, and thousands of hungry people. It just doesn't add up.
It seems impossible.
Totally impossible.
And it's in that moment of impossibility that Jesus steps in. He takes what little they have, gives thanks, and performs this unbelievable miracle.
Yeah.
Everyone eats, they're satisfied. And get this, there are 7 baskets of leftovers.
7 baskets. And, the number 7 in the Bible, it often symbolizes completeness or perfection. So it's not just that there was enough food, there's abundance overflow. God's provision goes above and beyond what we could even ask or imagine.
It makes me think about how often we try to solve things on our own, relying on our own limited resources. But what if, like those disciples, we brought what we had to Jesus, even if it seems small or insignificant?
That's where the miracle happens, right? It's in that act of surrender, acknowledging our need, trusting that God can take what we have and do immeasurably more with it. It might not look the way we expect, but he can transform those 5 loaves and 2 fish situations into something really extraordinary.
Yeah, and this deep dive into Matthew 15 has already been so rich. We've unpacked this idea of true holiness, the importance of persistent prayer, and now we're seeing this as an incredible example of God's abundant provision.
And it's not just about physical provision, is it? I think this story also speaks to our spiritual hunger, our deep need for nourishment that only God can truly satisfy.
Oh, absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Matthew 15, I think we've uncovered some pretty incredible truths about what it means to follow Jesus.
Yeah, we've seen that true holiness. It's not just about outward rituals. It's about allowing God to transform our hearts from the inside out. We've encountered the power of persistent prayer, coupled with humility and trust in God's timing. And we've witnessed the miracle of his abundant provision, both physically and spiritually.
And I think maybe most importantly, we're reminded that even in the midst of the storms of life, Jesus is right there with us, ready to calm the waves and speak peace into our hearts.
If there's one thing I hope listeners take away from this deep dive, it's this. No matter what you're facing today, no matter how impossible your situation might seem, Jesus is with you. He sees you. He hears you. And he cares. Choose to trust him. Lean into his grace and his power. He's the anchor in the storm, the source of true peace and abundant life.
That's beautiful. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Matthew 15. We hope it's encouraged you to go deeper in your own faith and to trust in God's presence and power no matter what storms you might be facing.